We are implementing our plan, which is threefold. The first one was, of course, to work on preventing tariffs. The second one was to make sure that we would be preparing a response. And thirdly, working on our long-term response, which is basically diversify our markets and also making sure that there are no trade barriers between provinces and territories across the country. So in the context of this plan in Washington, I've been working on the first phase, which is preventing tariffs. I've had very important meetings, particularly with key Republican senators, the first one being John Thune, who is the Senate Majority Leader. I also had meetings with Lindsey Graham, which is very influential on the Hill here in Washington. And I met also with the chair of the Foreign Relations Committee of the Senate, Jim Risch. I also had a meeting with Democrat Senator Jeanne Shaheen, who is also on the Foreign Relations Committee. And I had also a meeting with Tony Blinken, who is the outgoing Secretary of State, as we all know, who's a dear friend. Throughout my meetings, what I've done is really to explain what was at stake and how much the Trump tariff tax would have an impact on consumers on both sides of the border. I'm also in daily contact with many key Republican leaders that are involved in the administration of President-elect Trump. And for reasons linked to the fact that not all of them have been confirmed, a lot of them have asked me not to talk about it publicly. And so therefore, I'll keep these conversations private, but of course, these conversations are also very important. So I'm here to answer your questions. Just let me speak in French just a second. Bonjour tout le monde.
Hello, everybody. I'm here in Washington to talk about our plan. We've worked on a plan that is threefold. The first is to prepare our response. Actually, the first step, is to prevent tariffs. Second step is to prepare a response. And third is to talk about our more long-term response, so ensuring that we can diversify our markets and also prevent commercial barriers between provinces within the country. Here in Washington, I'm working on the first step of the plan, so trying to prevent tariffs from the Americans. I've had many important meetings, including the leader of the Senate Majority, John Thune. I've met also the Senator Lindsey Graham, who's very influential on the Hill here in Washington, Jim Risch, who's the senator in charge of the Foreign Affairs Committee in the Senate, and also the Democrat Jeanne Shaheen, who's senator of New Hampshire, who's also on the Foreign Affairs Committee in the Senate, and also my colleague and friend Tony Blinken, who's the Secretary of State, who is leaving his functions shortly. Throughout all of these meetings, I spoke about how the tariffs and the Trump tax on tariffs, the Trump tax and tariffs would truly be problematic and would have a negative impact on consumers on both sides of the border. I also have many other conversations. I'm in daily contact with many other members of the Trump administration, but since these people have not all been confirmed, some of these people have asked not to make our conversations public, and of course, I will continue to defend the interests of Canadians. Obviously, we'll always defend Canadians and we will never back down. So I'm ready to take your questions.
Thank you, Minister. If you have a question, please use the raise hand function. As usual, one question, one follow-up. Si vous avez une question, veuillez utiliser la fonction main levée comme à l'habitude. Une question et une question suivie.
One follow-up.
Raymond Fillon.
Raymond Fillon, go ahead. Thank you. Hello, Ms. Joly. So with the conversations you've had in the past few hours, you and your colleagues from the federal government, what do you expect from Mr. Trump next week? Do you have a better idea of what's waiting for Canada? I think we need to take President Trump to the letter. I think we need to take his threats seriously. So because of that, we need to be ready. But also what I am noticing on Parliamentary Hill is that there are many of the Republican decision makers are not very aware of the impact of those threats and the extent to which Canada would have levers that would have impacts on Americans and necessarily for them as politicians. So my job is to present those impacts and how this could hurt Americans. And I have to say that the reaction is a mix of surprise and at the same time taking Canada seriously, because what's important to understand here is that not only is Canada a export market for Americans, but imagine we are the export market that is the most important. Most important when you look, it's equivalent to what the US export to China, to France, to Great Britain, and Japan combined. So in that sense, this can be job losses in the US, but also an increase of cost of living in the US. And we know that President Trump and his team have campaigned on the fact that they were going to fight inflation, that they were going to help Americans access a more affordable life. So it's opposite to what they've said. And what they promised to the American people. Question, so are you leaving Washington today with the hope that Canada will, get out of it and avoid tariffs? Or are you still uncertain? Is it still a big question mark for you? When it comes to working with President Trump, we know that the final decision is him. It is the president himself. So we need to assume nothing and we need to be ready and defend. And that's exactly the work I'm doing right now in Washington. So we're giving a lot of information. We'll be ready to make sure and ensure that Americans themselves are aware that President Trump is about to inaudible.
Please go ahead.
Can you hear me now?
Hi, Tondo, I can hear you.
Great, thanks. Minister, I wonder if you could speak to word that Chrystia Freeland gave us today that if Canada were to do dollar for dollar counter tariffs against a 25% tariff from the US, that it would bring basically in 150 billion in revenue to the Canadian government. And since your government hasn't taken this off the table, could you speak to, I guess, what would be the impact on Canadians of that strategy counter tariffs and making other US imports expensive of those higher prices? And how would the Canadian government use that kind of revenue?
Well, we know that when we impose tariffs, these are revenues that go to the Canadian government. We also know that meanwhile, things become more costly across the country because of the fact that Americans are imposing tariffs on us. And so based on that, we want to make sure that ultimately, indeed, we use the revenues to support Canadians. But at the same time, Tana, we're still working on the first phase of our response, which is to prevent tariffs. We know that we can make sure ultimately also, while we're putting everything on the table in terms of retaliation, that we can work with different provinces across the country, including those that have specific industries that Americans rely on. And so that's why I think we can have really positive and constructive relationships and conversations with provinces and with premiers. And of course, the Prime Minister is very open to that.
Excuse me. speaking of those specific industries, I guess it's a kind of a related thing. What we have heard other outside experts kind of guesstimate what the impact would be of all of this on Canada. We haven't heard the government's own numbers about what the impact on Canada would be in terms of our GDP, our economy, our job losses nationally. Can you give us that today, given that you haven't given us an indication that any of Canada's arguments are landing right yet? What is your estimate of the national economic picture that is looming?
Well, I think that we're taking these tariff threats very, very seriously because we know that the impacts on Canadians would be really, really, really difficult. And why I'm saying that is we know that there would be lots of job loss across the country. And we know that this would also have an impact on cost of living for Canadians. I won't go into the details of what that figure is like, but definitely we have numbers that are highlighting how much this could be devastating. This would be basically starting a trade war. The Americans would be starting a trade war against us, and this would be the biggest trade war between Canada and US in decades. We've gone through a very difficult moment during COVID where we had to save many businesses and save a lot of livelihoods across the country. And so we have the experience of how we can address severe economic damage. At the same time, I think that there is still hope that if we use our levers well, that we can make sure that Americans backtrack. And that's why I've been saying everything is on the table, and we have to be able to show how much this will have an impact also on the other side of the border, which is job losses also in key states. And at the same time, this would result in hurting American consumers because also lots of things we export would cost much more. So these are the conversations that we're having, that I'm having. Like I was saying in French, Tana, a lot of senators are very surprised by the numbers we're giving them. A lot of senators have never heard about this Trump tariff tax. And a lot of them are understanding a bit more what would be their impact on their own constituency and how much this would go against a promise they made and President-elect Trump made during the campaign, during the elections, about making sure that the economy and life is much more affordable for Americans. So that's why I think that we need to continue to press people on the Hill in Washington and across the US, including key governors and state representatives.
Thank you. Next question is from Stephen Chase. Please go ahead.
Hi, Steve here. Can you hear me?
Hi. Yes, I can hear you, Steve. Go ahead.
So we've been making the case to the Americans for about 6 or 7 weeks now, and there's nobody, I think, in the world of economics that argues otherwise. The fact is that tariffs would increase the cost for Americans. So you've been talking to Republicans repeatedly now since November. What can they explain Mr. Trump's thinking? Can they explain why he's still willing to proceed with this, even though all the evidence to the contrary shows it would be bad for American consumers? I'm hoping to get inside the mindset of people you're talking to.
So while we are very organized and while we've been doing a lot of outreach, because of course we had in mind that President Trump tweeted about this beginning of December and linked it also to the border plan. My job, Steve, has been to say, you know what, border issue, yes, we're addressing it. We have a great border plan, $1.3 billion more boots on the ground, more drones, Black Hawk helicopters, K9 units, etc. And so we are preoccupied with also the border. We don't want your guns. We don't want illegal drugs coming from your side of the border. We will make sure that that doesn't happen on our side. And this is a win-win. So technically, there's no issue with tariffs because the border issue is linked to tariffs. And so the reaction from Tom Homan, the border czar himself, was extremely positive. He went on the news, said that was positive also. And so when I talk about that in Washington, people are reassured and they think, indeed, it is a win. And indeed, they're happy that Canada is moving in that direction. When I talk about the tariffs themselves and their impact, people in Washington are surprised. And when I mention the impacts of a Trump tariff tax on Americans, they're not only surprised, they're very worried. There's a level of disorganization that is happening in any transition. And so, while we've been very organized on the border and very organized in really talking about tariffs, people in Washington are just settling in. And so this is all new information. And so I think we still have a case to make. We have to continue to put pressure. Those that have gone through the steel and aluminum tariffs and what we did at the time very much remember how much this had an impact on their constituency. Don't want to see that again. But that's why we still have to do the work of talking to not only the Howard Lutnicks and the people that are part of the administration, but also the entire Hill. So I hope I'm answering your question right now, because I think Canadians need to know that while the entire country is united and that we will continue to defend Canadians and will never back down, at the same time, Americans are just waking up to this possibility.
Okay, as a follow-up question, again, you've been talking to people for 6 weeks. What's your best guidance to Canadians for next week? Should Canadians be bracing for tariffs?
We have to be ready. There's a level of unpredictability that is linked to Trump and his administration, and therefore we have to take the threats very seriously. We have no other choice. So that's why I'm here preventing tariffs and working the Hill. And I think having an impact that is really important. And particularly, I must say, with John Thune, who's a very senior Republican, and Lindsey Graham and Jim Rich, the reaction was unanimous. Basically, American senators themselves are saying, we don't want this. And so I think we can make sure that we have more allies. I think there's still a lot of work to be done. I think that I'm calling on business leaders, premiers, everybody having a relationship with Americans, and we know Canadians have so many of these relationships, to be united, because this is a defining moment. And there is clearly a chance for us to have a say in what President Trump will do next. And meanwhile, we just need to be united, because if we need to retaliate, we will do so, and Americans will discover Trump terror tax.
Thank you. We will take one last question. Nous allons prendre une dernière question. Sandrine Vieira, la parole est à vous.
Sandrine Vieira, question?
Est-ce que vous m'entendez?
Can you hear me? Yes, I can hear you, Sandrine, perfectly. Okay, thank you, Madame Joly, for taking our question. Can you please confirm whether your government is anticipating the announcement of counter tariffs on Monday if the president-elect makes his threat real as soon as he arrives in position? We have a series of measures that are already ready, certainly tariffs for imports. And if ever President moves forward on Monday, we will be ready. And we are ready for a second round and we're ready for a third round, and we're ready to put maximum pressure because this is a commercial war that President Trump would be starting, and this would have devastating effects on Quebecers and Canadians. So you can be sure that we are organized, and actually more organized than the Americans at this point. Question, and I would take my colleague's question from earlier on the uncertainty that is still floating around. What is the most plausible scenario at this point? We are at 3 days of his comeback. I was talking to people recently who were saying it could be 25%, could be more, could be less. The number could still change. Do you think the number could change? And in short, what are the clues that you have currently in terms of what could be announced? I think that the decision hasn't been taken. I think the only person who knows what decision will be taken is the president himself. And therefore, our challenge is to understand what he's thinking and to try to prepare for it. So what we're doing is we're controlling what we can control. And what I mean is being prepared. Under the circumstances, I'm here in Washington to defend the interests of Canada, to talk to Republican senators, and also to talk to those around him. But I think that Americans aren't aware the extent to which Canada is essential for them, for their own commerce, for their exports, for their energy, for just their different, goods, things that they buy at the grocery store. So if President Trump moves forward, Americans will find out. Thank you all. This concludes the press conference.
Merci tout le monde.